Chapter 14. Why is there evil and suffering? Had to show you my dog. The world is a mess. Section 1. What did they do? Watch the news? Okay. For many people, the existence of evil poses a problem for belief in a good God. In his book, The Innocence of God, Christian author Udo Mittelman states the problem frankly. Reality is such a mess. If there is a God in charge of this, God should be held accountable for a monstrous experience. Someone in heaven must be behind all this in the same way that there was always some evil ruler behind everything bad on earth. And that's the end of what he says. Not only does evil exist, it's everywhere. It trickles and soaks and floods into every aspect of our existence like nuclear waste from a burst storage container, contaminating everything in its wake. Can't God stop it? If he can't, is he truly as powerful as the Bible claims he is? If he can but doesn't, what kind of God is he? It seems that the only way to approach this question, as difficult as it is to begin with clear biblical definitions of good and evil. Good is the way things ought to be. Evil is what deviates from the good. Evil is not a thing in itself. The early Christian philosopher Augustine of Hippo explained, rather it exists in things, as a corruption or a cancer. As we saw in chapters 5 and 6, evil cannot exist unless that which is good has an actual essence or substance that can be corrupted, starved, sucked dry, or abused. Suffering is pain or discomfort that results from disease, injury, oppression, overwork, old age, sorrow for one's sins, disappointment with oneself or with one's lot in life, or that of persons close to one, the pain of loneliness, isolation, betrayal, unrequited love, and awareness of the suffering of others. Evil seems to be of two sorts. First, there is human-caused evil, or moral evil. Moral evil is committed by people, so it is hard to fully blame God. Still, couldn't God do at least something to alleviate the pain? Couldn't he step in and stop the really bad people from doing the worst evil? Why didn't he stop Hitler or a shooter who kills children at school, for example? The second kind of evil is natural evil, which includes fires, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, animal attacks, and anything that results from nature and causes pain and death. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, very near to where the publisher of this book is headquartered, massive wildfires in the summers of 2012 and 2013 scorched thousands of acres of spectacular mountain vistas. Even worse, the firestorms destroyed the homes and earthly possessions of hundreds of people. And that wasn't the end of it. The burn from one of the fires left a scar that does not absorb water. Now, when it rains, millions of gallons of water rush down the mountainside, creating terror and destruction. Lives have been snuffed out. Property has been destroyed. Businesses built over a lifetime ruined. And the floods will continue for a decade, residents are told, until new plants grow and the soil can absorb water again. Meanwhile, the burn scar stands as a silent reminder of how little control we have over nature. Compared to other natural disasters around the world, what we faced in Colorado was minor. Each year, disasters around the world disrupt the lives of tens of millions of people and claim tens of thousands of lives. This raises perplexing questions. Why doesn't God protect people from disasters they have no control over? Why does he allow suffering to multiply through drought, disease, flood, and fire? In this chapter, we'll see that although we don't have a God's eye view of the universe and therefore cannot know all the answers, only a biblical worldview truly grapples with evil and suffering. It offers a coherent view of the past, meaning to the present, and hope for the future. In the end, the cross of Jesus Christ stands as God's ultimate answer to the problem of evil, offering hope for redemption and restoration. Obviously, not everyone embraces a biblical worldview. As we will see, this does not exempt them from having to explain evil and suffering. Section 2. Everyone has a problem of evil. Many who reject Christianity and even God's existence because of the problem of evil overlook something very important. By rejecting one worldview, they must embrace another, and that new worldview must deal with evil and suffering as well. Because evil exists, every worldview must explain it. Do other worldviews offer more rationally or emotionally satisfying solutions? Let's look at how several address this issue. How atheists and naturalists deal with the problem of evil. Atheism, which is the belief that there is no God, and naturalism, the belief that everything can be explained through natural processes, that should sound familiar, contend that the problem of evil is that we have a problem with evil. Because there is no higher cause or plan, life is tough and bad things happen. That's just the way it is, according to these worldviews. As Richard Dawkins coldly states, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. As Dawkins sees it, there is no higher meaning. Life is painful, then you die. Deal with it. Some think that if evil just is, and there is no way to explain it, then the problem of evil vanishes. Not so. The problem of evil isn't merely that it exists, but rather that we know it exists and recognize it as evil. If the atheist and naturalist story of the world is true, where did the idea of evil come from in the first place? This dilemma was, according to C.S. Lewis, what led him to the rejection of his atheism. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Of course I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning, just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never have known it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. We humans sense evil because we sense that good has been violated. As Douglas Grudas says, in order for objective evil to exist, objective goodness must exist as well, and good must exist in a more fundamental way. Just as we can know we are sick because we know what it means to be healthy, we can see evil at work because we have some sense of the good corrupted by it. Of course, not all atheists and naturalists detach themselves from the problem of evil in a Dawkins-like fashion. Many truly want life to be more comfortable for themselves and others, and they genuinely believe that human reasoning can minimize suffering, that the world can be made a better place. Yet if we become obsessive about minimizing suffering through reasoning, we can short-circuit our experience of a fully meaningful life. Psychologist Paul Vitz calls the attempt to minimize suffering at all costs selfist psychology that trivializes life by claiming that suffering, and by implication even death, is without intrinsic meaning. Suffering is seen as some sort of absurdity, usually a man-made mistake, which could have been avoided by the use of knowledge to gain control of the environment. In the end, you either laugh or cry, so you might as well laugh. Like Sisyphus in the ancient Greek myth, who laughed at the gods while carrying out his absurd sentence, which was pushing a boulder up a hill each day and having it roll back down again for all of eternity. Yet even if this psychological approach did make suffering more meaningful, it is still an unsatisfactory solution. As Professor William Kirk Kilpatrick points out, what good does it do to be What good does it do to the billions who have already passed through this life in wretchedness that scientific humanism will one day create a world without suffering? For that matter, what good does it do to those who are right now dying miserable and lonely deaths all over the world? All that a strict humanism has to say to most of the human race living and dead is, too bad you were born too early, and too bad about your suffering. The bulk of the world's pain is written off as a bad expense. In the end, the atheist and naturalist response to evil amounts to little more than feathering the nest, adding a bit of comfort here and there, numbing the pain. The why question, though, still goes unanswered, perhaps even unasked. Then we move on to Marxists. Marxism marries atheist and naturalist assumptions to revolutionary class struggle, and it is a worldview dominating political life for roughly 20% of the world's population. As the founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, put it, according to the theory of socialism, of Marxism, the real driving force of history is the revolutionary class struggle. Evil is human-caused, Marxists believe, and the responsible party is the bourgeoisie, the business owners. These people must be overthrown by the proletariat, the working class. As Marx phrased it in the Communist Manifesto, the communist ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Proletarians of all countries, unite. To Marx, the workers were cleansed of evil through their hard work. Stop the domination of the bourgeoisie and most evil goes away. Of course, the bourgeoisie class presumably includes those who embrace the supernatural because they encourage the proletariat to drown its terrible economic plight in the spiritual booze of a mythical heaven rather than rising up against their oppression. The God-intoxicated make lousy revolutionaries. Unless they are cut off from God, they'll never sober up enough to revolt, and humanity's chance of creating a human-centered heaven on earth will be ruined. But by denying the evil in the hearts of the workers, Marxism made things worse, infinitely so. In their revolutionary zeal, Marxists discounted the suffering of the business owners, the wealthy, and the religious leaders as necessary bloodletting for their cause. Eventually, those who resisted Marxism, even the workers who were supposedly cleansed of evil through their work, became victims as well. Political scientist R.J. Rummel estimates that Marx's ideas led to the deaths of about 110 million people in the 20th century. Marxism became one of history's greatest sources of human-caused evil. In a sad irony, Marxist countries ended up destroying the people they set out to save, the working class. In universities today, Marx's ideas have spread beyond economics to literature, sociology, and philosophy. Neo-Marxists teach that those in power always manage government and culture in a way that serves their own interests and marginalizes others. Evil is whatever those in power do. Good is whatever those who neo-Marxists judge to be the oppressed do. Eastern religions and new spiritualists. Eastern religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Shintoism, and Confucianism share basic worldview beliefs with their Western counterparts, such as New Age thought, Wicca, Neo-Paganism, and Scientology. Together, we can group them under the heading of New Spirituality, primarily because of their belief in pantheism. This is from two Greek words, pan, which means all, and theos, which means God, so everything is God. All is God. All reality is one thing, and that thing is spiritual, not physical. The physical world is an illusion. Evil, or any kind of physical suffering, is also therefore an illusion. It doesn't actually exist. The idea that evil doesn't exist seems baffling to those who see evil and suffering as a universal aspect of the human experience. Haven't humans all over the world and throughout all of history suffered? What are we to do with this? In the Eastern world, it's really not much of an issue. The Bhagavad Gita, a treasured section of the Mahabharata, sorry, I don't even know how to say that, India's national epic poem, has Lord Krishna responding to Aruna's grief by saying, "Although you mean well, Aruna, your sorrow is sheer delusion. Wise men do not grieve for the dead or for the living." If sorrow over pain and suffering is delusional, the antidote is to stop grieving. Krishna's statement represents the general tenor of Hindu writing on evil and suffering, though Hinduism is a very diverse religion and not all Hindus hold this view of suffering. Among most who follow Hindu tradition, though, compassion toward the suffering is explicitly frowned upon. Whole classes of untouchables are ignored by those who believe that alleviating suffering is wrong, because it cuts short the atonement for the sins of past lives. It was not devout Hindus, but devout Christians such as Mother Teresa and the Sisters of Charity who sought to alleviate suffering as a way of displaying Christ's love, offering a warm heart rather than a cold shoulder. Buddhism's approach to suffering runs along a parallel path. Finding an end to suffering is the whole point of Buddha's teaching. In his first sermon, Buddha outlined several different kinds of suffering, including birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow, pain, grief, and despair. The cause of this suffering, he said, was attachment. We are like a monkey who finds himself captured because he refuses to let go of the treat that is holding his hand inside a trap. Releasing attachment is the only way to be free. The end of suffering, Buddha said, is the complete cessation of that very thirst, giving it up, renouncing it, emancipating oneself from it, detaching oneself from it. So in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the right response to suffering is not to sympathize with the person experiencing it, but to remind that person that sorrow over suffering is delusional. Rather than grieve, the individual ought to let go of the attachment that causes the suffering in the first place. In contrast to their Eastern counterparts, Western pantheists of the New Spiritualist mold tend to focus on the pursuit of health and success. Sickness and disease occur because people are not sufficiently in tune with what pantheists call the higher consciousness. Best-selling New Spiritualist author Marilyn Ferguson explains, "Health and disease don't just happen to us. They are active processes issuing from inner harmony or disharmony, profoundly affected by our states of consciousness, our ability or inability to flow with experience." To Shakti Gawain, another New Spiritualist writer, we experience pain because we don't trust ourselves to overcome it. Every time you don't trust yourself and don't follow your inner truth, you decrease your aliveness, and your body will reflect this with a loss of vitality, numbness, pain, and eventually physical disease. The Western version of New Spirituality, that evil is an illusion we permit into our lives by not properly pursuing our interests, still doesn't answer the question, why evil? Rather, it makes people wonder, if evil is an illusion, why does it seem so real? For the Eastern version of New Spirituality, based on the twin ideas of karma and reincarnation, the evil we experience is payback for things we did in previous lives. This is unsatisfying as well. Think of a child suffering from disease. Think of a beloved grandparent getting cancer. Think of the victims of sex trafficking who are condemned to misery for the transitory pleasure of those who overpower them. According to Douglas Grotius, the doctrines of reincarnation and karma do not really solve the problem of evil because they cannot explain the reality of evil. One of the engines of the problem of evil is innocent suffering, he says. This is a vexing conundrum for any worldview, but karma does nothing to solve or alleviate it. According to karma, there is no unjust suffering. Everyone gets what he or she deserves, even supposedly innocent children. How Muslims deal with the problem of evil. Of the major worldviews, Islam's approach to dealing with evil is closest to Christianity's, yet, though Islam and Christianity, along with Judaism, share a belief in one God, there are major differences between Islam's and Christianity's approaches. Islam is Arabic for submission. As a religion, Islam focuses on obedience to God and complete submission to Him. Such a life of obedience brings peace of the heart and establishes real peace in society at large, writes Khurshid Ahmad. Muslims acknowledge humans as rulers over the earth but reject the imago Dei, or image of God, seeing humans instead as slaves of God rather than his image bearers. The difference between the Christian and Muslim views on this point affects how Muslims deal with the problem of evil. As Udo Mittelman observes, Islam requires the unquestioning submission to and acceptance of a divine destiny. To Muslims, why evil exists is the wrong question. God need not explain himself. Humans must simply obey, and in so doing, they will find meaning in life and peace in death. So in the end, Islam's answer to the problem of evil is unsatisfactory as well. If God causes it, and we can never really know why, the only answer to the question of why evil is to stop asking the question. Obviously, there are dozens of religious perspectives in the world. We have surveyed a few of the biggies and found that they offer little in actually addressing the questions of evil and suffering. For atheists and naturalists, it is a meaningless question. For Marxists, evil results from economic conditions and can be atoned for only by inflicting vengeance on the rich. In the case of Eastern religions and new spirituality, evil is an illusion and should thus be ignored. To Muslims, asking why evil occurs is disrespectful to God. None of these views explains why evil feels wrong or why we feel compelled to do something about it. But even if other worldviews do not have a sufficient answer to the problem of evil, this does not mean that Christianity wins by default. Christians must still grapple with the problem both rationally and personally. Let's start with the rational aspect. Section 3, Dealing with Evil Rationally. Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow aptly summarize the problem of evil from an intellectual standpoint, and they say, when you encounter the vast literature on evil, two intellectual problems of evil emerge. First, it seems logically contradictory for a good God and evil to coexist. And second, given the magnitude, duration, and intensity of evil in the world, it is highly improbable that God exists. If God is really good, then he would abolish evil, unless he is incapable of doing so. Thus, either God is not good or he is not powerful. You can't have it both ways, at least according to the popular argument. It will take some time and patience to delve into the rational arguments about what evil is, how it came into existence, and how theologians in the past have explained a biblical approach to it, but it's worth it. Along the way, we'll discover that the Christian answer to the problem of evil not only explains the past, but also gives meaning to the present and hope for the future. Christian answer to the problem of evil. What is evil anyway? Maybe you've seen a fallen tree with a rotten core, or a car rusted out from underneath. Without the tree, there would be no rot. Without the car, there would be no rust. As we saw earlier in this volume, evil is like that rot and rust. It exists only by attacking that which is whole. Most people have no problem seeing human-caused evil as a result of sin. We've seen married people who were blissfully happy at their wedding fall into a pattern of abuse or unfaithfulness. The destructive actions of a married couple, or the corrective actions they neglect, causes emotional and physical pain, sadness, and fear. Sin is, as author Cornelius Plantinga bluntly puts it, a parasite, a vandal, a spoiler, and a ludicrous caricature of a genuine human life. Theologically speaking, evil is the loss of shalom. As we saw in our earlier chapter on the meta-narrative of Scripture, shalom is a Hebrew word describing peace with God, peace from war, and peace with one's neighbors. To wish another person shalom is to wish that person completeness, safety, wellness, prosperity, tranquility, contentment, and friendship. God originally created human beings in a state of shalom. Their existence was one of wholeness in their relationship with God, with each other, and with creation. In the fall, each of these relationships was ruptured. We now live in a world that is truly not the way it's supposed to be. We read in chapters 5 and 6 that the flow of history is the process of God setting things to rights. At the very heart of the Christian gospel is a God rich in grace, dealing with evil and suffering personally. God's answer to the problem of evil is not as much a set of logically stated answers as it is a life offered up in our place. Hebrews 4:15 says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Christ came to be with us, to suffer with us, and to accept the brunt of evil on our behalf." Where did evil come from? One key biblical question is, where did evil come from? Did God make it? If so, isn't that an evil thing to do? Sort of like Dr. Frankenstein creating a monster and unleashing it on the world? It's a simple question of negligence, and God ought to take responsibility. And if God did not make evil but permitted it to exist, isn't that a sign of weakness? Neither of these options is good. It appears at first glance, at least, that either God is sadistic and likes to see us suffer, or he's a hapless bumbler who pushed over a cosmic domino and set the universe to tumbling. As is often the case, though, what we see at first glance is not the whole story. To understand this, we need to look at how sin actually entered the universe and what happened as a result. Though the Bible is not explicitly clear on this, there are good reasons to think that sin got kicked off when an archangel named Lucifer, otherwise known as Satan, tried to overthrow God. Satan then inhabited a serpent in the Garden of Eden and tempted Adam and the woman Eve to sin. This is in Genesis 3. In Revelation, the last book of the Bible, 12:9 and 22, this ancient serpent is described as the devil and Satan. So how could a creature such as Satan fall into sin and cause humanity to fall in his wake? Perhaps, as Norman Geisler suggests, no one caused Lucifer to sin. He caused his own sin. Did God create evil? As we will see shortly, by creating free creatures, God made evil possible. These creatures chose either to withhold good or act contrary to it, thus taking potential evil and making it actual. For example, if God makes a world with stones in it, people might pick up some of those stones and fling them at one another. The potential evil of having stones as a part of the material world becomes actual evil when misused. But if God is all-knowing, would he not have stopped this process before it got out of control? To answer, we must clearly understand what it means for God to be all-knowing. As we saw earlier in this volume, the word omniscient is used to describe God's all-knowingness. God knows everything possible and actual. He possesses complete knowledge of the past, present, and future. Knowing all truths and believing no falsehoods, he is perfect in knowledge. We see this throughout scriptures, such as in Romans 11, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God." As Gordon Lewis puts it, God's intellectual capabilities are unlimited, and God uses them fully and perfectly. We humans, on the other hand, are severely limited. We cannot see the full scope of history or figure out the relationship between people and events in the past and in the future. God has no such limitations. Hebrews 4 says, "No creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." To say God is sovereign, though, is not to say that he maintains absolute control, as an engineer running a machine seeks to do. Rather, he is the ruler of the universe. He is in charge and has created a world of laws in which we can act in a meaningful way. Philosopher William Lane Craig wrote an entire book about God's knowledge titled Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom. In it, Craig argues for a position called Molinism, which was first articulated by a Jesuit priest named Louis de Molina. We'll go with Molina. Molina proposed a middle knowledge view of God that avoided the idea that God directly causes every single action in the universe. If you believe that God causes every single action in the universe, that's called divine determinism. Okay, so let me go back to the sentence. Molina proposed a middle knowledge view of God that avoided the idea that God directly causes every single action in the universe, and also its opposite extreme, known as open theism, that although God is knowledgeable enough to make very accurate guesses about what will or won't happen in the future, he does not know with certainty. What makes the problem of what God knew and when he knew it especially sticky is that some Christians hold such a strong view of God's sovereignty that there is little to distinguish it from the Muslim perspective that everything that happens comes into being from God's will, not ours. However, if we recognize a difference between what God is capable of doing and what he chooses to do, we can see that the Christian perspective on God is quite different from the Muslim perspective. As R.C. Sproul, a well-known Reformed theologian, writes in reference to sin coming into the world, God ordained the fall in the sense that he chose to allow it, but not in the sense that he chose to coerce it. Here's how Craig frames the middle knowledge view of God. Because God knows all things, he knows the choices free creatures make under every possible circumstance, and yet he still leaves them free to make those choices. As we make choices, God knows what will happen as a result and is working things out so that when we arrive at the place where our free choices take us, we will see that he has worked in such a way that his good desired end is achieved. A biblical example of this is when Jesus replied to Peter's boast about his loyalty. Jesus said, "Truly I tell you this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." This is in Matthew 26. Peter then did just as Jesus had said, but that is not the end of the story. After his resurrection, Jesus forgave Peter in a tender exchange and recommissioned him for faithful service. That's in John 21. Jesus knew ahead of time what Peter would do, yet he permitted him to do it and forgave him once it was done. He even gave Peter the opportunity to affirm his love for Jesus 3 times, just as he had denied it 3 times. So why, if Jesus knew that Peter would deny him, did he not stop it? Perhaps because a Peter who had fallen and been redeemed was a better Peter than the one whose bravado, or his boasting, had gotten him into so much trouble beforehand. Indeed, perhaps all creation is this way. It is better to be redeemed than to have never fallen. Is evil necessary? If we program a computer to say, "I love you," we know it isn't real love. The computer is just doing what it is told to do, but God did not create humans to be computers. We can be truly loving only by choosing to love, and in order to choose to love, we must be free to reject love and choose hate. To explain the relationship of freedom and evil, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga articulated what has been called the free will defense. It goes like this. A world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all, and they do not do what is right freely. To create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. As it turned out, sadly enough, Some of the free creatures God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good. A key phrase is, he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. The freedom to choose good, therefore, entails the freedom to choose evil. Unfortunately, many make that choice or back into it by neglecting what is good. But wouldn't it be possible for God just to say, enough, and put a stop to the bad things that happen? On this point, author Mark Middleburg muses. When I hear someone say this, I like to ask them which freedoms they think God ought to take away from us right now. Usually people get a bit more reflective when they realize that stopping all evil in this fallen, sinful world would entail taking away our human liberty, as well as stopping all of us in our tracks. The people, to one degree or another, are right now actively participating in that evil that must be stopped. We may hate the painful effects of our actions, Middleburg points out, but we humans continue to take the freedom-abusing actions that bring them out. We've just taken a look at what evil is, how it came to be, whether God created it, and how it is necessary for the human freedom that allows us to genuinely love and serve. The biblical view of evil makes sense of the past, but it also, as we will see, gives meaning to the present. If your head hurts, do not fear. This is heavy stuff. Just keep going. The Christian answer to the problem of evil makes sense of the present. Those who reflect even briefly on the problem of evil can see how pointless it seems that evil and suffering exist. Although other worldviews say evil is a meaningless concept, or an illusion, or that it is disobedience to God to ask the question in the first place, the biblical worldview of the problem of evil helps us make sense of our lives right now. Let's examine this issue theologically, considering our own limited perspective and God's unlimited perspective. Let's also consider that in spite of the pain we experience, this is the best possible world. And then let's ask what we humans ought to be doing about evil. God is purposeful and unlimited in understanding. Our perspective of the world and everything in it is quite limited. I cannot know what is going on at any moment outside my own sphere of influence. Even within that sphere, I have little ability to make things go my way. I cannot know the future and how the various people yet to be born will act. However, God is not like us. Isaiah 46 says, I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. So if God has a larger perspective, is it possible that he has a good reason for allowing evil to enter the world, a reason we might not be able to see? If he does have a good reason, it would break the logjam between God being either well-meaning and powerless, or powerful but ill-intentioned. We've already seen how evil must be possible in order for human freedom to exist, but how probable is it that God has good reasons for permitting suffering? Skeptics might say, look around you. So much suffering seems pointless. Couldn't a powerful God figure out a way to at least reduce the suffering even a little bit? In order to make this argument, skeptics would need an objective standard for good and evil, as well as a standard by which to show that suffering is, in fact, indefensible. Their own worldview precludes this. However, if Richard Dawkins is correct in saying DNA just is, and we dance to its music, then little can be done about suffering aside from anesthetizing it. Because nothing can be done about evil, the atheist or naturalist argument here isn't as much about the problem of evil as it is about attacking the character of a God they don't believe in. As humans, we do have a sense that evil is meaningless and that suffering is pointless. If bad people simply got what was coming to them, we might be less concerned. But when seemingly innocent people get hurt, especially our loved ones, our questions multiply. It's important to note, though, that biblical authors were not immune to this, nor did they try to hide it. The prophet Jeremiah implores, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all who are treacherous thrive? As hard as this seems to bear, we simply may never know this side of eternity, why bad things happen to good people. But as William Lane Craig says, as finite persons, we're limited in space and time, in intelligence and insight. But God sees the end of history from its beginning and providentially orders history to his ends through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering that appears pointless within our limited framework may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. This does not mean we should stop asking questions of God. The biblical authors operating under God's authority and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit certainly did not stop asking questions, but our mindset and attitude matter. Arguments against God's goodness, such as those posed by William Rowe, a philosophy professor and author of a popular argument against God based on the problem of evil, assume that what we know is sufficiently representative of what God knows, and therefore we are justified in saying that pointless suffering indicates there is no God. As philosopher Greg Gansel points out, I can't think of a good reason for allowing this evil, so there isn't one. There isn't one is a weak argument if we aren't as smart as God, or even as smart as we think we are. Gansel illustrates this from the life of Christ himself. Let's take the case of Lazarus' death in John 11. Lazarus was likely in the prime of his life. He's a good man and a close friend of Jesus. Lazarus becomes ill and dies. The citizens of his village, Bethany, could see such an evil and after 3 days of mourning come to the conclusion that there is no reason for this. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Then Jesus comes to Bethany. Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, chastise Jesus for not getting there sooner. As we read John's account, we see that unbeknownst to Mary and Martha, Jesus had reasons for delaying. Moreover, there were reasons Lazarus was permitted to die in the prime of his life. When Jesus arrived at Lazarus' tomb, he prayed and then called Lazarus to come out of the tomb 4 days after his death. The reason for Lazarus' sickness, death, Jesus' delay, and Lazarus' resuscitation was that God's glory might be seen. Some of the citizens might have thought they had a strong case against the existence of God the 3 days after Lazarus died, but subsequent events placed the evil of Lazarus' death in a much different context. In the light of this context, Lazarus' death is seen to be part of a much greater good than anyone in Bethany could imagine. When we see evil things happen, it may not be that God is unaware or helpless, but rather that larger factors than we can see with our human eyes are at play. So rather than denying that evil exists or denying that it has meaning, God followers through the ages have recognized that evil does exist, that it hurts, and that we might go to our graves with our most pressing questions unanswered, and yet we will pray for patience and perseverance in the confidence that God knows what we do not know, and that He will redeem our suffering to good purposes. Let's stop there.